Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental: how children develop.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
We've gathered insights looking at, well, everything from the biology of growth to the influence of culture, even the power of play.
Right.
Our goal really is to give you a clear, engaging picture of all these forces that shape a child, from infancy right through adolescence.
Exactly. Childhood might seem straightforward on the surface, but the science shows this period of incredible change.
Biologically, psychologically.
Emotionally, too. And
Yeah.
what happens in those first 5 years especially, it really sets a crucial stage.
Not just for the child, right?
No, not at all. It impacts the health of society as a whole, really.
Okay, so childhood isn't just one long period. Our sources break it down.
Mm-hmm. Into phases.
Yeah, there's early childhood, so that's like babyhood up to around age 6. Think about those big milestones: first words, walking,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Then you move into middle childhood, roughly 6 to 12, before things really shift again with adolescence.
In adolescence. It's interesting. We usually think puberty, 12 to 14 maybe.
Typically, yeah.
But some views, like the World Happiness Report,
Yeah.
apparently suggest it could go much later, maybe even up to 24.
It's a long stretch, and the whole journey, if you think about it, is about moving towards more independence.
From total dependency.
Right. Totally reliant on caregivers at the start, and then gradually gaining more autonomy. It's a continuous process.
But not always smooth, I guess.
Well, there's a general order to how things unfold. But, and this is really important, every child's path is unique.
So they won't all hit milestones at the exact same time.
Exactly. And their previous experiences, they really shape where they are right now.
And underpinning all this, you have some really fundamental factors. Our sources point strongly to genes,
That biological blueprint we inherit.
and also things that happen even before birth, during pregnancy, those prenatal events.
Yeah, they can have a surprisingly lasting impact, and it connects to whole fields of study, doesn't it?
Right, like developmental psychology, which looks at growth across the whole lifespan.
From birth to death, basically.
And pediatrics, obviously, focusing on the medical side for kids.
So if you pull all these pieces together, you really start to see the complexity.
It's not just physical growth.
No, it's the mind, emotions, the social world, everything interacting.
And that's what we want to dig into today, pulling out the key ideas from our sources so you can get a richer picture of these powerful influences.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Well, let's dive into those influences. A good way to understand child development is through different theories, right? Different perspectives.
Yeah, think of them as different lenses to view how kids grow and learn, and it's interesting how many different angles there are.
Okay, so our sources bring up some key thinkers. One is Vygotsky.
Ah, yes. Vygotsky really focused on learning through doing, that hands-on experience.
Which sounds a bit like Piaget, maybe?
It does align with Piaget in some ways, but Vygotsky added this crucial element, the need for timely, sensitive help from adults. He called it the zone of proximal development.
Right, the ZPD.
Exactly. Imagine a child trying something new. The zone is that sweet spot where they almost have it, but need just a bit of support to get there.
And that support, that's scaffolding.
That's the term, yeah. Building new skills, step by step, using what the child already knows as a foundation.
Okay, like the example in the source. Playing patty cake.
Perfect example. You gently guide the baby's hands at first, clap or roll them until they start doing it themselves. That gradual help is the scaffolding.
Makes sense.
And Vygotsky didn't just see development as this steady, linear thing. He thought there were these periods of qualitative transformation, like turning points or crises where thinking really shifts.
Interesting. What other theories were highlighted?
Another really big one is attachment theory, Bowlby and Ainsworth.
Okay, that focuses on the emotional bonds, right, between baby and caregiver.
Exactly, those close connections or attachments. The core idea is that these early bonds aren't just nice, they're absolutely essential for healthy social and emotional growth.
A fundamental need.
Pretty much, yes.
Our sources also brought in some newer ideas related to this, like shared intentionality. Tomasello.
Yeah, that's about how children start to grasp social interactions. It suggests that even right from birth, there are these sort of unaware, almost automatic processes going on as babies learn socially.
Shaping how they understand what others are thinking or intending.
Right. It's foundational for social cognition.
And there was another one, the mother-fetus neurocognitive model. Danilov. That sounded pretty wild.
It's definitely intriguing. It suggests a kind of synchronization between the mother's and baby's nervous systems even before birth.
Like their brains are networked.
Kind of, yeah, like they're coupled, working together. This connection is thought to help the baby's nervous system start organizing itself based on the mother's experiences and signals.
Wow. So the mother can sort of guide the baby's attention to important sensory stuff, even in the womb.
That's the idea, helping them start to make sense of the world incredibly early. It's thought to involve things like neuronal coherence, maybe even the electromagnetic field from the mother's heart setting a kind of template.
Incredible stuff. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How does development actually happen? That age-old nature versus nurture question always comes up.
Always. And the sources remind us development runs parallel with age, but age itself isn't the cause of the changes.
Right. So what are the basic causes?
Well, it boils down to our genes and our environment. And crucially, how these two constantly interact. It's never just one or the other.
So genes are driving cellular changes, body proportions, brain development, the maturation of functions.
Exactly. And it's interesting, genes aren't static. They can be turned on or turned off at different points, triggering changes.
And on the environment side.
That's everything else. Diet, disease exposure, all the social, emotional, cognitive experiences. It's incredibly broad.
But kids are pretty adaptable, aren't they?
Amazingly so. They can often thrive across a pretty wide range of environmental conditions.
Which brings us to plasticity.
Right. Plasticity is basically the extent to which development can be shaped by the environment alongside genetics. Some things, especially things heavily influenced by early experiences, show high plasticity. They're very moldable.
While other things are more strongly driven by the genetic blueprint.
Correct. And then you have these fascinating gene-environment correlations, where genes and environment are linked in specific ways.
Okay, our sources mention 3 types.
Yeah. First, passive correlation. This is where parents provide both the genes and the environment. Think of musical parents creating a music-filled home for their musically inclined child. The child shares their genes and lives in the environment shaped by those parental genes.
Got it. Then evocative.
Evocative correlation is when a child's genetic traits elicit certain responses from others, shaping their environment that way, like a naturally cheerful baby getting more smiles and positive attention.
Okay. And the third, active.
Active correlation is when the child actively chooses experiences that align with their genetic predispositions. A naturally muscular kid seeking out sports, for example.
And all these interactions make it really tricky to separate out what's purely genetic and what's purely environmental.
It's extremely difficult. They're constantly intertwined.
So how do researchers try to study all this complexity? What methods do they use?
Well, there's a whole toolkit. They often start with observational research, just watching kids in natural settings.
Like noting how reflexes change in the first year.
Exactly, describing what happens. That might lead to correlational studies looking for relationships. How does vocabulary size relate to age, for instance?
But correlation isn't causation.
Precisely. So you might use longitudinal studies following the same group of kids over time.
Or cross-sectional studies, looking at different age groups at one point in time.
Right. Or often combinations of these approaches. And sometimes, where ethical and practical, researchers use randomized designs to compare interventions like different teaching methods.
Studying babies must be particularly challenging, though. They can't tell you what they're thinking.
No, they can't. So researchers get creative. One classic method is high-amplitude sucking, or HAYS.
For really young infants.
Yeah.
Birth to 4 months.
Yeah. It uses their natural sucking reflex. Basically, they measure the baby's sucking rate, introduce a sound or picture.
And see how the sucking changes.
Exactly. Babies tend to suck harder or faster for novel things, and more rhythmically or slower for familiar things. It shows what they notice, what they prefer.
Clever. What else? Eye tracking.
Eye tracking is great. You can see if a baby understands a word by tracking where they look. Say, cookie. Do they look at the cookie?
Simple but effective.
And then there's habituation. You show a baby the same thing repeatedly until they get bored. Basically, their looking time drops off.
They habituate to it.
Right. Then you show them something new. If they suddenly look longer again, it means they notice the difference. It tells us about their perception, their cognition.
So you can use looking time to figure out if they can tell colors apart or different sounds.
All sorts of things. It's a powerful tool for understanding the infant mind.
Okay, moving along the developmental path, we often talk about milestones. What exactly are those in this context?
Milestones are basically significant changes in specific abilities, physical or mental, that mark the end of one developmental period and the beginning of another.
Like markers on the journey.
Kind of. And in stage theories of development, they actually signal the transition from one stage to the next.
How are they established? Just averages.
They're established by studying when kids typically achieve certain tasks. But, and this is key, there's considerable individual variation. Everyone develops at their own pace.
Right, like the example of understanding speech versus actually speaking.
Exactly. Receptive language understanding tends to emerge around a similar time for most typically hearing babies. But expressive language talking, the timing can vary quite a bit more.
So when should parents worry about delays?
The concern arises when a child is significantly delayed compared to the range of typical development for their age, not just the average age itself. Early identification and support are crucial.
Okay, let's shift to the physical side. Growth is obviously a huge part of childhood.
Incredibly rapid at first,
Yeah.
especially that first year. Then it slows down until puberty hits.
The sources had some striking timelines. Weight doubling by 4 months.
Tripling by the first birthday, but not quadrupling until around age 2. It slows considerably after that initial burst.
Notopubertal growth spurt.
Right, which usually kicks in somewhere between 9 and 15, give or take.
And it's not like the whole body grows at the same rate, is it?
No, definitely not. At birth, the head is proportionally huge, much closer to its adult size than the rest of the body. The torso and limbs do most of the catching up later.
Makes sense. What about motor development? Learning to move.
Also very rapid early on. Those infant reflexes change or disappear within the first year. Then the pace of motor learning slows down a bit.
And there are patterns to it.
Yes, predictable patterns. Cephalocaudal, head-to-foot control. And proxima distal center of the body, outwards.
So head control before leg control.
And torso control before fine finger movement.
Exactly.
And learning to get around seems to follow a sequence, too.
It generally does. Creeping, crawling, pulling to stand, cruising, walking while holding on, then maybe walking with help, and finally independent walking.
And later skills, like riding a bike.
In middle childhood and beyond, learning new motor skills often involves instruction or observation rather than following such a strict biological sequence.
There's a connection mentioned between motor skills and executive functions. Things like memory, impulse control.
Yes, it's a fascinating area. Some research suggests that developing motor control might actually help lay the groundwork for those higher-level cognitive skills.
Interesting. And obviously nutrition and exercise are important here.
Vital for strength, flexibility, coordination, accuracy of movement.
The sources also mention frontal lobe development. Back to front. Right. The back part of the frontal lobe handles motor control, and it develops earlier than the middle and front parts, which are more involved in logic and reasoning. That helps explain why motor skills often seem quite advanced before complex thinking really kicks in.
So kids need opportunities to move.
Absolutely. To develop flexion and extension, which are fundamental. Skilled movements, like catching or throwing, really come down to practice and learning.
The idea of mastery climates came up too.
Yeah, creating supportive environments where kids are motivated internally to practice and improve motor skills. It connects nicely with Piaget's ideas about active learning.
Do we see big individual differences in motor skills?
Definitely. Things like weight and body build can play a role early on. Smaller infants might crawl a bit earlier, for instance. And experience matters. Babies with more floor time often crawl sooner.
What about skipping stages, like belly crawling?
While not all infants belly crawl, some go straight to hands and knees. Skipping belly crawling might sometimes affect later crawling proficiency, but it varies.
And after infancy?
Practice, observation, instruction, those become huge factors driving individual differences.
Are there times when atypical motor development is a concern?
Yes. Things like reflexes sticking around too long or significant delays in walking can sometimes be indicators of broader developmental delays or conditions like autism, cerebral palsy, or Down syndrome.
The sources also suggested matching activities to personality and mentioned benefits of sports.
Right, encouraging participation in things kids enjoy. And organized sports can teach valuable skills: teamwork, leadership, responsibility. There was even an anecdote about teamwork experience fostering time management.
What about differences between groups of kids, population differences?
Well, while the core ways of understanding the world through movement seem universal at birth, there are some variations. Girls sometimes show a slight edge in fine motor skills early on, like for clear speech articulation.
Any biological links?
Some studies have noted ethnic differences in newborn reflexes. hinting at possible biological factors. But culture is also huge, shaping which movements get practiced, like specific hand gestures or sports skills.
Okay, let's switch to cognitive development thinking, learning, reasoning.
Again, we see typical individual variations in when kids achieve cognitive milestones, but schools often assume these differences aren't enormous.
Which could be a problem for kids with delays, especially in cultures that really value abstract thinking.
Exactly. If a culture demands strong problem-solving, reasoning, abstract thought, then delays in those areas can be challenging. That's why early screening and intervention are so important.
Interventions like.
Encouraging reading, playing thinking games, sometimes involving professionals.
What about the social and emotional side? How does that develop?
Parenting practices seem to be pretty predictive of emotional intelligence. Things like the time mothers spend interacting and the quality of those interactions.
They matter for more than just bonding.
Yes. They foster skills through modeling, reinforcement, shared attention, learning social cooperation.
Do we see population differences here too?
In older children, yes, often linked to learned gender roles or specific cultural customs. There's also some connection between social-emotional development and the timing of puberty.
Language is another massive area. How do kids learn to talk?
It's an amazing process. Our sources outline about 6 major stages in learning syntax sentence structure.
Starting with single words used like sentences. Around 12 months.
Roughly, yes. Moving through stages of adding modifiers, forming subject-predicate structures, changing structures around, categorizing words, and finally getting to complex syntax, which can continue developing up to age 10 or so.
And understanding comes before speaking.
Generally, yes. Receptive language understanding starts developing gradually from about 6 months. Expressive language talking really takes off after the first year, often with that vocabulary explosion mid-second year.
And grammar rules kick in around age 2.
Around then, yes. Then you see this progression between, say, 20 and 28 months where they start using negations, pronouns, short sentences.
It's a steady build through preschool and school.
It is. Though even teens might have smaller vocabularies than adults and struggle with trickier grammar like the passive voice.
What was that point about accents? Babies struggle with unfamiliar ones.
Yeah, up to about 15 months, they often don't recognize familiar words spoken in a very different accent. That ability develops closer to age 2.
But hearing a familiar story helps.
Interestingly, yes. If they hear a familiar story read in the new accent first, they seem to bridge the gap. Suggests the underlying language understanding is there.
And it's not just words and grammar, is it? There's pragmatics.
Right, understanding the intention behind communication. That develops alongside language. Plus, discourse skills, how to have a conversation, and sociolinguistic knowledge using language appropriately in different social settings.
Are language delays common?
Unfortunately, yes. They're the most frequent type of developmental delay, about 1 in 6 kids, and more common in boys.
Can cause frustration.
Definitely leading to behavioral issues sometimes. A major cause is hearing impairment. Even mild loss can have a big impact.
But deaf kids learning sign language keep pace.
Remarkably, yes. If they're learning sign from signing parents, they develop it just as hearing kids develop spoken language. Delays can also be linked to intellectual disability or autism.
Okay, what about gender identity? How does that develop?
The sources suggest it's likely an interaction between genes and prenatal hormones, but, well, the specifics aren't clear.
We don't know exactly which genes or how they work.
Not precisely, and the evidence is still limited. The role of socialization after birth is also still being figured out.
Kids seem to actively look for gender cues, though.
They do. They seek out information about gender roles, but how much influence role models, parents, friends, media actually have on their core gender identity is still an open question.
Let's broaden out to culture. How big an influence is that?
Immense. Culture is described as a powerful indicator of well-being. It shapes values, language, beliefs, how we understand ourselves.
Where does this influence come from?
Parents, obviously, but also the wider environment. Media.
Yeah.
How society views different cultures affects a child's confidence and social skills later on.
So parental culture shapes child rearing, discipline, boundaries.
Exactly. Parents are essentially preparing children for their specific cultural context. Problems can arise, though, if the home culture clashes significantly with the school or community culture.
Like collectivist versus individualistic cultures.
Right. They value different things community needs versus individual needs. This affects discipline, focusing on how actions affect others versus personal consequences. It even affects how kids learn to describe themselves.
And clashes between home and school rules could be confusing.
Very confusing for a child.
Environmental influences also include physical things, right? Hazards.
Absolutely. Community safety, pollution, contaminated water, lead exposure. Children are more vulnerable because their bodies are developing and they take in more contaminants relative to their body weight.
With potentially long-term impacts.
Yes, on health, schooling, work, socialization.
And media, how does that fit in culturally?
Media acts as a cultural force. A lack of diverse representation or exposure to negative stereotypes can really harm a child's self-esteem.
Okay. Another major factor discussed is socioeconomic status, or SES.
Measured by income, education, occupation. And the research seems pretty clear. Ongoing persistent poverty is more damaging to IQ and cognitive skills in shorter periods of hardship.
So long-term financial stress is linked to cognitive difficulties.
Yes, and it contributes to a cluster of other issues. Poorer academic outcomes, less family involvement in school, iron deficiency, infections, lack of stimulation, malnutrition, higher risk of lead poisoning.
There's a direct correlation shown between income and IQ.
Studies show a correlation, yes, with children from persistently poor households generally performing less well academically than middle-class peers.
What about parents' jobs and education levels?
The impact is complex, research findings are a bit mixed, but maternal education level does seem consistently linked to children's skill development. And things like paid maternity leave might offer benefits.
Home environments vary too, based on SES.
They do, often differing by age, ethnicity, and poverty status.
Does poverty affect social and emotional functioning too?
Yes, particularly highlighted for African American children in some studies. And it's linked to health issues like parasitic infections and exposure to toxins, lead, arsenic, pesticides, which harm development.
Are there other specific factors mentioned that affect development?
Yes, things like poor growth in the womb, intrauterine growth restriction that's associated with learning deficits and lower IQ.
And trauma.
Tragically, yes, exposure to violence, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, these can have really harmful effects on cognitive development.
The sources also specifically discussed neglect.
Right, defined as failing to meet a child's developmental needs, care, stimulation, nutrition. It's called the most widespread form of child maltreatment.
With lifelong consequences.
Potentially, yes, but it can be hard to assess and identify.
How do professionals try?
Often by looking at developmental indicators, weight, height, stamina, social emotional responses, speech, motor skills. Assessing if a child is failing to thrive can be a starting point.
But you have to rule out other causes.
Exactly. Differentiate neglect from delays caused by genetics or illness. And it's tricky because defining and measuring sufficient nurturance is inherently difficult.
And it's not just parents. Institutions can be neglectful.
That's an important point raised. Neglect isn't just about parental behavior. It can be seen as a process of developmental delay due to insufficient nurturing care, wherever that failure occurs.
Okay, let's shift to something hopefully more positive play. How important is it?
Absolutely essential. Our sources stress its importance for cognitive, physical, social, and emotional well-being. It's even recognized as a right by the UN.
And a great way for parents and kids to connect.
Definitely. But there's a problem.
Less free play nowadays.
Significantly less, it seems. Due to hurried lifestyles, changes in family structures, maybe an over-focus on academics and structured enrichment.
And all the marketing for educational toys and programs.
That contributes too. It can make parents feel pressured, leading to overscheduled kids with little downtime for just playing.
Is there a link to anxiety and depression?
There's concern that these pressured lifestyles might be contributing to the rise we're seeing in anxiety and depression among kids and teens. Finding that balance is crucial.
Between structured activities and free, imaginative play.
Exactly. That free, child-driven play is vital for building resilience and learning to cope with stress.
So what are the solutions?
It's multi-layered. For disadvantaged kids, tackling poverty and inequality is key to creating safe spaces for play, alongside better childcare and education access.
And for all kids.
Promoting strategies for healthy development rooted in parent-child connection and just valuing play itself. Pediatricians often recommend ample unscheduled, independent, non-screen time.
Letting kids be creative, decompress.
Yes. Prioritizing child-driven play over constant adult direction. Encouraging active play. Using simple toys that spark imagination, true toys.
So the advice for parents is?
Listen, be caring, guide through discipline, but also just share enjoyable time together. Be critical of marketing hype. Read to your kids.
Find a balance with schedules.
Right. Tailor schedules to the individual child. Let them explore interests without pressure to be top performers in everything.
Before we wrap up, the sources mention the funny side of childhood, too.
Huh. Yes, briefly. Those less serious, chaotic moments, the questionable haircuts, the failed stunts, they become the amusing stories later on, don't they? Part of the whole experience.
Absolutely. So, reflecting on all this, child development is truly complex and multifaceted.
Incredibly so. It's this constant, intricate dance between biology, psychology, social factors, culture, environment.
And while we see these predictable patterns, every single child's journey is unique, shaped by so many different experiences and contexts.
Which leads us to a really important final thought for you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah.
In today's world, what do you think is the right balance between structured learning and that unstructured free play for fostering a child's full potential and well-being?
And thinking about your own experiences or what you see around you, what small changes could you maybe advocate for to help create more supportive environments for children's growth?
Something to really mull over.